Good afternoon, class. Today we're going to be talking about the gross anatomy of the brain and cranial nerves. So we're going to talk about the different regions of the brain. We'll talk about the structures and functions. And we're also going to talk about the 12 cranial nerves. We're going to talk about their location and their function also. So here's a list of the topics that we will discuss. The cerebral hemisphere is divided into four lobes: the frontal, parietal, temporal, and occipital lobes. The diencephalon consists of the thalamus, hypothalamus, and epithalamus. The brainstem consists of the pons and medulla oblongata, and then we have the cerebellum, and then last we will talk about the location and function of the 12 cranial nerves. And here is a figure highlighting the cerebral hemisphere, diencephalon, brainstem, and cerebellum. And we will go into more detail about each one of those in the upcoming slides. When looking at the cerebral hemisphere, you can see a lot of ridges and grooves. So essentially, the ridges are gyri and the grooves are sulci. And these ridges and grooves, especially the grooves, the sulci are shallow grooves, and then you have really deep grooves, which are called fissures. Okay, so these fissures and sulci are going to be used to divide the brain into the four different hemispheres: the frontal lobe, parietal lobe, occipital lobe, and temporal lobe. It's going to be certain sulci that will be used to, divide the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe, and so forth and so on. So those are natural ridges and grooves that are present in the brain, and they are used as ways to further divide the brain up into hemispheres. But if you just look at the right and left parts of the brain, superior parts of the brain, you can break that into right and left easily by this longitudinal fissure. Again, that fissures are going to be a very deep groove, and that can just simply break the brain into the left and right hemisphere. And essentially, the right and left hemisphere are going to communicate with each other through the corpus callosum. And we'll talk about the corpus callosum more later on, and you'll be able to see it in other figures and diagrams that we have, but you can't see it right now. But again, you can divide the superior part of the cerebral hemisphere into right and left hemisphere just by using the longitudinal fissure. Okay, and again, the fissures are deeper than sulci. Sulci are shallow grooves, fissures are deep grooves. Okay, but again, we will use the sulci to make a lot of when we break the hemispheres, the cerebral hemisphere into the frontal, parietal, temporal, and occipital lobes. We're going to use a lot of those natural features of the sulci to do that. You can see from this figure how you have certain sulcus. So again, their name pretty much tells you their location, right? So central sulcus, you see it's in the central part of the superior part of the cerebral cortex, and it separates the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. Okay, and then you have a lateral sulcus. Okay, so this lateral sulcus gonna separate the parietal lobe from the temporal lobe. Okay. Also, separating the frontal lobe from the temporal lobe. Also, and then you have the parietal occipital sulcus that's going to separate the parietal lobe from the occipital lobe. All right, and then right here you have the cerebellum, and then you have the pons and medulla, and then you have the spinal cord. And you also see right here the difference between a fissure and a sulcus. So again, a sulcus is a shallow groove, whereas a fissure is going to be a deeper groove. So a deep sulcus, okay. Um, and the from different experiments, a lot of these things that people did or scientists, the way they learned about the brain, because the brain is one of those things that it's hard to study. And a lot of ways that scientists learned about different functions of the brains were through brain injuries. And essentially, through brain injuries, and sometimes through what's considered pretty much unethical now procedures, like doing a lobotomy is considered unethical now, but back when they did it, they considered it a treatment. But so through cranial injuries and then through certain what's now unethical medical procedures, we have learned that different lobes of the brain control different functions of the body. So with the frontal lobe, that is generally where higher executive functions, including emotional regulation, planning, reasoning, and problem solving. So again, a patient was injured, some kind of head injury accident, and they damaged the frontal lobe, and then they were pretty much unable to what we normally would hide and conceive from people that we don't want to show certain emotions or you don't want to say certain inappropriate things. The patient no longer had the ability to hide his emotion, and he, always said inappropriate things. All right, so his emotional regulation was lost. So, again, through injuries, that's how they figure out, functions of the frontal lobe. The frontal lobe also contains the primary motor cortex. So that's the major region responsible for voluntary movement. The parietal lobe is behind the frontal lobe and it's separated by this central sulcus. Okay, and the parietal lobe is responsible for integrating sensory information, including touch, temperature, pressure, and pain. So your sensory information gets interpreted in the parietal lobe. The temporal lobe, which is separated from the frontal lobe by the lateral sulcus, it's responsible for processing sensory information, hearing in particular, and also recognizing language and forming memories. The structure in the temporal lobe that's responsible for a lot of the forming memories and learning emotions is the hippocampus. And the hippocampus it's closer to the midline of the brain of the temporal lobe. All right, and you can't see it from this diagram, but it's the hippocampus. It's located in the medial part of the temporal lobe, and it's important for forming memories, learning, and emotions. The occipital lobe, which is separated from the parietal lobe by the parietal occipital sulcus. All right, so the occipital lobe is the major visual processing center in the brain. The occipital lobe receives primary information from the eyes, and then the information is relayed to several secondary visual processing areas. So this slide is just recapping what we already talked about. So again, fissures should have added sulci in this part right here. So sulci, and fissures divide cerebellum into lobes. And again, you have your frontal, parietal, occipital, and temporal lobes. And they all have different functions. And again, a lot of what they've learned about how those different lobes have different functions came from brain injuries, okay, from patients who had brain injuries in certain parts of the brain, and they found out that certain things were affected. Um, so this is just a gross anatomy image of what we got through talking about. So you just see it in an actual gross anatomy image. So again, parietal lobe, frontal lobe, temporal lobe, occipital lobe, cerebellum, your brain stem. All right. So the layers of the um, cerebrum has a certain pattern to it, and also this goes for the cerebrum and also goes for the cerebellum too. So you have essentially on the outer layer of the cerebral cortex, it's gray matter, and the reason why it's gray because it's composed of the neuron cell bodies. So if you remember from our neuron lecture for lab that with an axon you have the cell. Well, I'm sorry, with a neuron you have the cell body, and then you have the axon which moves away from the cell body. Okay, and those axons are going to be what makes up the white matter. So the axons are going to be myelinated. Remember, the myelin serves as an insulator for the axons, helps propel the action potential. So the axons are going to essentially form tracks. They're going to be, remember, with a neuron, it's going to receive sensory information in, okay, and then it's going to send a signal out, and the signal is going to go out through the axon, and the axon is going to make up these fiber tracks, all right, and they're going to be white in appearance. So it's going to, the way the cerebellum is arranged, the gray matter is the outer layer. It's going to be where the cell bodies are housed, and then um, deep into the cerebral cortex, you have the white matter, all right, and you find fiber tracks, all right. And again, we talked about the corpus callosum. It connects the right and left hemisphere, and in the next couple of slides, you'll see an image of the corpus callosum. But again, it allows the left and right side of the hemisphere to communicate. And then, but you also have, so again, you have the gray matter, which has cell bodies, neuron cell bodies, but those aren't the only place that you can find neuron cell bodies. So deep within the cerebellum, so even deeper within the white matter, you can have what's called basal nuclei. Okay, so you can kind of think of those as an island of gray matter, all right, buried down within the white matter. So these are going to also be cell bodies, okay, but they're going to be deeper, buried down within the white matter. Okay, so certain structures, you'll find the basal nuclei, and they serve a purpose of regulating voluntary motor activities. All right, and then we'll talk about this on the next couple of image, but the most important basal nuclei are the caudate nucleus, putamen, and globus pallidus, okay? And again, they're important for regulating voluntary motor activities. And so this last little part where it says, you can see the arbor vitae tree of life. This is dealing with the cerebellum. So I don't believe I have an image of it in the slides, but if you cut, did a transverse cut of the cerebellum, again, you will see the gray matter on the outside, and then you will see the white matter on the inside, and the white matter tracks, they look kind of like a tree. Okay, so that's what the name comes from, arbor vitae, tree of life, because of the appearance that it looks like a tree. And again, you can look in your lab manual on page 276 to see that arrangement. This is a transverse cut of the cerebral cortex, and you can see the pink right here. This is your basal nuclei, and that's going to be your globus pallidus and your putamen. Okay, and this pink up here is also basal ganglia or basal nuclei, but that is going to be your the head of your caudate nucleus. All right, and then this teal color is going to be the lateral ventricle. Okay. This structure right here, purple, that's your thalamus. Okay. And then you see your corpus callosum. You see how you have these tracks running from the right to left hemisphere. Okay, that's the corpus callosum. And then you have your cerebellum here. You have your pons here. And then you also have your medulla oblongata there. And we'll talk about more about what the thalamus, pons, and medulla oblongata does in the next few slides. And I may have said this wrong. This is the third ventricle, okay, right here. And this is the lateral ventricle up here. So third ventricle, lateral ventricle. And those ventricles are going to be locations where they're going to be filled with cerebrospinal fluid. So again, those ventricles are going to be filled with cerebrospinal fluid. And this is just a view of the corpus callosum. A mid-sagittal view. All right, so now let's talk about the diencephalon. So it sits on top of the brainstem, and it is made up of three parts: the thalamus, hypothalamus, and epithalamus. And we're going to talk about what those do more in the next slide. On this slide, you can see the location of the thalamus right here. All right, and this is the hypothalamus right here, and then this is only one part of the epithalamus. All right, so that right there is the pineal gland. Okay, and the epithalamus has another part, the posterior commissure, which is essentially right here, and a commissure just allows two different sides to communicate with each other. Okay, that's all a commissure does. Allows two different sides to communicate with each other. But this is the pineal gland right here. All right. So now let's talk a little bit more about what the thalamus, hypothalamus, and pineal gland, which is part of the epithalamus, what those structures do. Okay, so the thalamus is a major integrating and relay station for sensory impulses going upward. So remember, You have sensory coming from your body, so your body senses thing and that has send it to your brain to interpret. So if it's dealing with your eyes, okay, that's going to go through the optic nerve. Okay, that's going to deal with the optic nerve. If it's dealing with your hearing, okay, that's going to go to your um, temporal lobe, and the vision is going to go to the occipital lobe. But if it's sensory information other than those two, it's going to go to the parietal lobes. Okay, all right. So the thalamus is going to relay that information up to the area in the parietal cortex that it belongs. The hypothalamus is an important autonomic center involved in the regulation of body temperature, water balance, and fat and carbohydrate metabolism, as well as other activities and drives, such as when you're hungry, thirsty, also your sex drive. All right, so moving on to the epithalamus. All right, you have the pineal gland. So the pineal gland isn't fully understood, but they do know that it produces and regulates a hormone called melatonin, and melatonin is important for regulating sleep patterns. Okay, the brainstem consists of the midbrain, pons, and medulla oblongata. So the midbrain, essentially this region right here. You see this green part right here. That is the corpora quadrigemina. And then this part right here, this teal part, is the cerebral aqueduct. Okay. All right. So that is part of the midbrain. And then you have the pons. And right there, and then you have the medulla oblongata right there. The cerebral aqueduct connects the third ventricle to the fourth ventricle. The pons, again, the pons is important because it relays information from the cerebral cortex to the cerebellum. It also takes part in the medulla oblongata is the main respiratory control center, but it also cooperates with the medulla oblongata with the with breathing. Even though again the medulla oblongata is the main control center, but it also the pons has the cranial nerves 5 through 7 are found in the pons. Okay, cranial nerves 5 through 7 also found in the pons. All right, so the medulla oblongata does a lot of things. So essentially, it's a control center for respiration, heart rate, vomiting, coughing. It also has cranial nerves 8, 9, and 10, and 12. So 8 through 10 and 12, you can find cranial nerves 8 through 10 and 12 in the medulla oblongata. So the medulla oblongata has a lot going on. All right, so these slides pretty much summarize what I got through talking about. So again, the midbrain, mostly composed of tracts of nerve fibers, has 2 bulging fiber tracts, cerebral peduncles. It has 4 rounded protrusions, and it is the reflex centers for vision and hearing. Okay, and then the pons, again, mostly composed of fiber tracts, has nuclei involved in the control of breathing. You also find cranial nerves 5, 6, and 7, and their nuclei are located in the pons. The medulla oblongata is the lowest part of the brainstem. It's going to merge into the spinal cord, and it does a lot of important things. It has a lot of important control centers: your heart rate, blood pressure regulation, breathing, swallowing, vomiting, and it also has cranial nerves 8, 9, 10, and 12. The nuclei for cranial nerves 8, 9, 10, and 12 are found in the medulla. Here's another image of a mid-sagittal view of the pons, medulla, and the midbrain. And here's the corpora quadrigemina, and here is the cerebral peduncle right here. The next few slides, I just put these tables in for a summary of what we got through talking about. So I'm not going to spend any time talking about it. It's just there for you to review. It's just a summary of what the different areas of the brain we were talking about. And if we didn't talk about it, like the limbic system, you're not going to be responsible for it. So if there's something in the table that we didn't talk about, you're not going to be responsible for that. And we didn't talk about the reticular formation either. All right, so you're not going to be responsible for that. But I think those are the only two structures that we did not talk about. All right, so the cranial nerves. All right, so the cranial nerves are part of the peripheral nervous system. All right, so they primarily serve the head and neck. Except for cranial nerve 10, the vagus nerve, that's going to extend into the thoracic cavity. All cranial nerves arise from the brain stem, except for cranial nerve 1 and 2, which are your olfactory and optic nerves. And most cranial nerves are mixed nerves, meaning they contain both motor and sensory fibers. So again, think about it this way: you have your sensory fibers are always going to be running toward the brain, okay, toward the cerebellum. Toward the cerebral cortex. And I mean, sometimes it could be the cerebellum, so it depends on where it's going. But it's going to be going up. Sensory is going to come from the body, going up, and then you're going to have tracks going down from the brain, different areas of the brain, to the motor neurons that can do, make your voluntary motion, or it might be involuntary, autonomic movement. So reflexes too. So you have those motor neurons are going to be going away from the brain, okay? And essentially most of the cranial nerves are mixed, except for cranial nerves 1 and 2, olfactory and optic nerves. Those are pure sensory. And here's a mnemonic to remember the cranial nerve order. So again, there's 12 of them. And again, a lot of times coming up with your own mnemonic, a lot of times is more effective. But do whatever helps you remember it. So this one is: on occasion, trusty truck acts funny, very good vehicle anyhow. And the first letter of each word and the A and H of the final word, anyhow, will remind you of the first letter of the cranial nerves. All right, and I have a table on the next slide, I believe. Actually, I don't know. I don't have the table yet, but this is just the diagram of, so you can see the cranial nerve. So you see the olfactory nerve here, the optic nerve here, and this little thing right here is called the optic chiasm. Okay, so that deals with your smell olfactory nerve, and then the optic nerve deals with vision. Okay, and then you have oculomotor nerve right here, 3. Then you have trochlear, 4, 5, trigeminal, 6, abducens right here, 7, facial nerve, 8, vestibular cochlear nerve, 9, glossopharyngeal nerve, 10, vagus nerve, 11, accessory nerve right here, and then 12, hypoglossal nerve. And on the next slide, I have a table that summarizes the function of the cranial nerves. And here's another mnemonic. Again, you make up your own, but this one is: on old Olympus, towering tops, a Finn in German view some hops. Okay. Again, make up any little crazy, funny, and mnemonic that works for you. But again, it has the um, cranial nerve number, the name, and the function. Okay. And then this also tells you the connection. All right. And then it tells you also the peripheral connections, central connection and peripheral connection. All right. So definitely know the cranial nerve number and function. And you should know the central connection. We didn't really talk about the peripheral connections, but the central connections we did talk about. So you should know the central connections. So name, function, and central connections. All right, because we did talk about those structures, but we didn't talk about the peripheral. Really the peripheral connections. Even though it may want to hurt you to know that also. All right, so that is the end, because you aren't doing the dissection today. I have given you some other assignments in the lab manual to work on, and I'm going to upload this video shortly.